Welcome to another episode of Tribunate. Today I am on with Nick Holmes. He is an author of a number of books on the late Roman Empire, including the Roman Revolution. Nick, welcome to the program.
Thanks very, very much, Gaius, for letting me be on your excellent show. And just a couple of words about me. So, I've written 5 books on the fall of the Roman Empire, and I start with the crisis of the 3rd century, which I know is the topic you're looking at the moment. And I continue, though, quite late into Justinian's empire, the rise of Islam, and into the Byzantine period as well. And I'm looking at the moment at the Dark Ages, which I see as very much the legacy of the Roman Empire. But I'm very, very interested in the crisis of the 3rd century.
Great. So, as you studied the crisis period, can you give us an overview of what kind of causes you feel like contributed to the crisis? Because it looks like in the 2nd century, things are going about as well as they could be for a continent spanning empire, right? So there's this relative dominance of the 2nd centuries. Obviously, there are hiccups and there are border skirmishes and even invasions during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. But on the whole, things seem to be going about as well as you could expect. But then the wheels seem to fall off rather quickly. Could you give an overview as to why that happens?
Yes, I mean, I think historians have long debated the external and internal causes of not just the fall of Rome, but the crisis of the 3rd century. And I'd certainly think that it's the external ones which are the most important. I don't think there was any intrinsic reason why the Roman Empire was going to fall. I think it was the combination essentially of the Sasanians replacing the ineffective Parthians and, Ardashir and Shapur making Persia great again, so to speak. Plus the Germans. The Germans unite into much bigger entities like the Goths and the Alemanni, and the Goths, led by Cniva, defeat and kill Decius at the Battle of Abritus in 251, and then Valerian is defeated and taken prisoner in 260. And I think that's really the key to the crisis of the 3rd century. It's external pressures. But there are also, just to finish fully the my answer, there are also obviously a host of internal reasons why the empire struggles to respond, and we can look at those in more detail. I think that's the most difficult part of the analysis, is looking at the internal side, and I think we've got a whole lot of them. For example, financial, we've got plague, we've got climate change, we've got decline of the Roman army, which I think is something a lot of historians haven't looked at in enough detail. And perhaps the most complex is societal change, the growth of the latifundia, those massive agricultural estates and so on. So there's an enormous amount here to talk about.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's honestly one of the aspects that makes this century so fascinating, is that you've got a lot of things kind of come to a head. Because I kind of view this crisis period as the bill coming due, so to speak, whereas in the 2nd century they had put off a lot of problems and kind of coasted
Yeah.
on past reputation and past successes without addressing some structural issues that were beginning to chip away at the solidity of the structure. And then all it takes is a push. You mentioned those external forces and the forces of climate really combining to throw a wrench into what had been a functioning machine. But then once the gears get jammed up, it seems like the whole thing rapidly falls apart. So as Rome kind of confronts this, does the society recognize the issues they're facing, and are they able to address them head on? Because you had mentioned that there are significant changes which occur to make Persia more unified and strong. And then the tribes beyond the borders also become more unified and strong. Does the Roman state change at all during this period, from the Severans to the end of the crisis period, which we can generously say happens during Diocletian's reign?
I think that it's very difficult for us to get into the minds of the everyday Romans, and it's easier to get into the minds of the Roman elite because we do have the literary sources coming from them, but not the everyday Romans.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, we know that something really profound is going on in the empire in the third century. We know that Christianity is increasing exponentially, but we don't really know, I think, at the everyday Roman level quite why that is happening. I think we know a great deal more about the elite, and we know that the real driver of change is, I think, a financial strain being imposed on the government, and this causes the army to be prioritized. The financial strain is coming from the army, paying the army. I mean, the Severans are the ones who, say enrich the soldiers and scorn all others, and really they
Right.
create this crisis of a military crisis. The army takes over, and then this leads into the dominate, which people would say begins with Diocletian, but I think really begins actually with Claudius Gothicus when there's this political revolution right at the top of the Roman Empire. A non-aristocrat, a peasant from Illyria, famous as a prize wrestler, becomes emperor, and he's made emperor by the army in Milan. And this is a revolution. And the Senate is pushed aside, and the city of Rome is pushed aside. And it's really because of the financial crisis that only the army can deal with. The army has to take over. And so that's what's going on at the top of Roman society. And the senators are being sidelined, and you have a new kind of military aristocracy almost taking over. But when it comes to everyday people, and Gaius, I know you're very interested in this area, and it's a very good one and incredibly important, but I think it's terribly difficult for us to know really what's going on. I'd say that the one thing that's really striking is a rejection of the values of the old empire. So we know Christianity is popular because the ancient gods are no longer respected in the way that they used to be, and that it's not just religious, there's a whole change within civic society. There's a breakdown of municipal authorities, isn't there, as the barbarians invade the West and the East, and city councils have everything stripped by the army in order to pay themselves. But sorry, you were going to say.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that there's a tendency to focus so much on this religious shift because obviously, that religious shift resulted in the rise of Christianity, which is still, the dominant faith in Europe and much of the world today. So it's still very much with us in ways that other cultural shifts that would have occurred are not. And I think one that maybe you would agree with me on is that a significant shift occurs in how legitimacy is confirmed and how succession ideology kind of shifts in this period from, the adopted valorizing the adoption that occurred during the second century to military success becoming the chief arbiter of, is this ruler worthy? It's not who he's descended from. It's not who he is chosen by. It's, has he won on the battlefield? Does that thereby communicate that he has, divine favor?
Absolutely. I think that's what it's all about at the high level in the dominate. It's all about success on the battlefield, because the Romans in the middle of the third century, they didn't have any success on the battlefield.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, I
Yeah.
think we can't uh, we can't emphasize enough the contrast between the way the Roman Empire in the second century dominated the world. It basically never lost a battle, whereas in the third century it never won a battle until you have the soldier emperors taking over. And so it's a real revolution, it's a profound change within government, and it becomes a military aristocracy, I think. And I think, if I may, just continuing with that theme, Constantine puts a different spin on it. He gives the military autocracy that Diocletian and before him Aurelian and Claudius Gothicus created, a religious justification. And I think your point is so relevant. Was this religious justification a visionary thing? What we think of it as being visionary, that Christianity was founded and so on at that time. But I rather doubt Constantine did. I think he was a pragmatist who found it helpful that he had the support of the Christians in a changing society, and it justified his own rule. So, I mean, we're so much in a different world
Right.
by the reign of Constantine. And I think that's the remarkable thing, just how much the Roman Empire changes in 100 years. And yeah, so it is. I don't know what you think of that.
I would agree that I think that, we tend to view the Severans as kind of like that last gasp, but they were already in like a very different world from what we would call the High Empire, right? The
Right.
crisis had not dawned, and the Rome was not losing battles on its frontiers to either tribal invaders or the Persians, but like you had mentioned, I think that shift towards the how Septimius Severus has to win a civil war, and therefore he kind of rejects other notions of legitimacy in favor of, make the army happy. That's what he tells his sons.
Yes.
But
Yes.
they kept that. I always think it's funny that Caracalla kept that part of the advice, but he did not agree to be harmonious. That was the one,
Hmm.
so he got half credit for listening to
Yes.
his dad's deathbed advice.
You're
Uh,
absolutely right. Yes. Yes.
so I think that's super interesting, but do you believe that this fact that Rome does transition so dramatically, and it changes shape from during the third century, is that something that you feel like would have been intelligible to the average person? Because to me, it seems like at least the first stage of the crisis emperors, be it Philip the Arab, be it Decius, be it Trebonius Gallus, they're trying to put things back together the way that they remembered them fitting together. But it ends up being, round holes or round pegs in square holes, right? And it just doesn't work, and they meet with failure. But then when you get to the barracks emperors, perhaps later, they're saying, a new system needs to be in place. We need to have a new way of organizing our empire. So, and they start to meet with some success, Aurelian, for example, but it's still quite touch and go until we get to this later period of Diocletian and Constantine. So, do you want to say that Diocletian, Constantine, the Tetrarchy, how things are organized in that period, can that be looked at as something that quote unquote ends the crisis, or do you think that's an oversimplification?
Well, I think what you've described about the empire fundamentally changing with Diocletian and Constantine is absolutely right. Because if we look at Aurelian, he was very conservative. Even Diocletian was very religiously conservative, and we have the Great Persecution.
Right.
So there is a real wish on the part of some people within the Roman top hierarchy to want to go back to the old empire. And I think that is, it's a fascinating example of a society in crisis, isn't it? Roman society and government in the third century, it's half of it wanting to go back to classical Rome, but half recognizing that things are so different now that things have to be done in a different way. And I think if we look at Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian, they were simple soldiers in a sense, and they would probably have said, look, we want to go back to the old classical empire. But Diocletian, I think, is much more cerebral, and he's looking at the practical problems of the new environment that has to be dealt with. So he's coming up with a tax system, with the Tetrarchy. He's really, I mean, I think this is why Diocletian is so important in Roman history, because he's remolding the empire in order to meet the new challenges. And I mean, didn't he say, Aurelian, of course, who was his great benefactor and responsible for his for putting him in charge of the army, he said Aurelian was a great soldier, but was he a great emperor? And I think he was saying, you know, Aurelian didn't really have the vision to meet the new demands that the empire was facing. So Diocletian, I think, is an extraordinary figure. But then we get to Constantine, and he goes one massive step further. You know, he's taking the administrative reforms, and then he's taking the empire east to Constantinople,
Hmm.
and of course he's embracing Christianity, you know, two fundamental changes.
Right, and I feel like this is one of the reasons why I find Diocletian so fascinating is because he has ambition and he can kind of he's the first guy in a while to be able to see beyond, what's right in front of his face, right? And granted, when you're only emperor for 1 or 2 years, maybe you don't have time to enact a strategic vision. So Decius might have had that, but all these emperors who were cut down really early, they might have had that, but they don't have the longevity to pursue it. Whereas Diocletian, I think, though I do want to give him credit, he doesn't do everything right. There are obviously serious flaws with the Tetrarchy, given that it collapses so soon after his abdication. But in the Tetrarchy, I see a man who's rising to the moment, so to speak. Somebody who at least recognizes the old ways aren't going to work in a one-to-one system anymore, and that old world is kind of irrecoverable. So, what do you think about Diocletian as somebody who's clearly flawed, but embarking on a program of change that he thinks is necessary?
I think you're absolutely right that he is so strikingly dynamic in terms of not just dealing with the problems of the moment, but looking for a longer term solution. I mean, he does have that vision, which is so rare, isn't it, amongst leaders and politicians. I would just digress momentarily just to say that maybe Aurelian might have had that if he hadn't been assassinated in that sort of
Right.
bizarre incident, you know, in 275, where
He's kind of the greatest what if of Roman history, I think.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think people don't focus enough on that. There are so many what ifs, aren't there? I mean, obviously Julian the Apostate later on, but Aurelian,
Right.
you know, he could have, he was a magnificently capable soldier, and who knows, he could have been the great emperor that Diocletian perhaps a bit meanly said he wasn't. And but to get back to Diocletian, I mean, I think Diocletian is absolutely remarkable. I mean, the way in which he envisages the new tax system, the budget. I mean, it's so amazingly, I was going to say, ahead of his time. That's a horrible
Mm-hmm.
anachronistic phrase to use because he's obviously not ahead of his time, but he is incredibly visionary in his analysis of what needs to be done to the Roman Empire. And I think as an administrator, he is absolutely remarkable. And I think he understands the need to defend the empire against a repeat of the crisis of the invasions in the third century. So Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian, and I suppose we could say to some extent Gallienus, before them, are able to deal to some extent with the crisis as it happens. But Diocletian is really looking at how do I prevent this thing happening again? And I think one of the things that if you live in Europe, you can see very tangibly, very visually, is the extent of fortification that exists dating back to the late third century. I mean, here in Britain, we have massive Roman forts that date back to that time. And I was in France quite recently looking at Carcassonne, which is just an enormous Roman fortress, essentially. And then, of course, we have Aurelian's walls, which around Rome, which perhaps are the first to go up. But there's a real sense of a need to redevelop the empire into a fortified military state. And I think we have a lot of, tangible evidence of this today. And I think we don't know exactly when a lot of those fortifications were built, but I sense that probably the majority were initiated by Diocletian. And of course, one thing with Diocletian again, if you go to Rome, you can go to those extraordinary baths that he built.
Mm-hmm.
It shows the wealth that was still within the empire, and maybe he was responsible for tapping that wealth with his new tax systems. But I think one thing you were interested in is the resilience within the empire, what made it survive the crisis of the third century. And we can see that there is tremendous wealth in the empire, and Diocletian is able to direct that in a meaningful way towards a military restoration. So I think he achieves the reformulation of the Roman state in a way, of course, that Augustus did in a somewhat softer way. I mean, in retrospect, the external issues were so easy for Augustus. He didn't really have any external problems aside from the Teutoburg
Yeah.
forest massacre, but that was an absolute one-off. And his priorities were all very much internally focused, I think. But Diocletian is very externally focused, and it's mind-blowing, I think, what Diocletian does achieve.
Right. I think it's strange that Diocletian being such a transformative figure
Yes.
is overshadowed a bit by the fact that Constantine comes immediately afterwards, and we kind of can overlook Diocletian as somebody who's just, oh, he divided the empire in four. Why did he do that? That doesn't seem very smart. And that's kind of like the pop level understanding of who he was and what he did. But as you mentioned, I think the tax transformation is remarkably transformative because of how it severs, the army command from the provincial administration, which is actually what really, more than anything else, ends that, interminable cycle of internal rebellion that had been, perpetuating this crisis. There were obviously 1,000 factors, but it's not helped by having a civil war every 5 years, right? So, Diocletian, more than just a cabbage farmer, right? So, can you just provide a quick overview of how the Tetrarchy does break down when Diocletian does decide to start farming cabbages full time? He envisions this as a stable system. It proves to be anything but then ironically, the man who rises to the top from that chaos ends up being the one who, it doesn't always work out this way, but is probably the one that's best suited to solidify Diocletian's vision.
Absolutely. And I think it's a paradox, isn't it? And it's a contradiction to some extent of what I was advocating about Diocletian, that the Tetrarchy isn't really that well thought through. I mean, it is the one example. I mean, it's a shame because, as you said, it's what we all remember Diocletian for. But it's probably the least clever of his reforms, and he appears to be settling the problem of government, and the problem of civil war. I mean, we haven't touched on civil war too much so far, but civil war has been a significant issue in the third century, and this is, I think we all know, because there were so many armies around the Roman Empire under different generals, and they competed and they ended up fighting each other. And this is what the Tetrarchy is meant to eliminate. And we all know, though, that it's an ineffective method of doing this because it relies essentially on having a sort of band of brothers, doesn't it? They have to all get on. And with Diocletian, they do, because they're all his mates or people who he's promoted. And it's not going to work longer term. And I think that's the great criticism of Diocletian, that the Tetrarchy lacks the longer strategic vision that his reform of the tax system has.
Tetrarchy is one of those things to me that is, it looks so great on paper,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like it's like when you have some philosopher or
yeah,
something who promulgates a grand political
yeah,
theory that will solve everything,
yeah,
and it's like, well, yeah, it makes sense internally,
yeah,
but then there are actual people in the world, right? And I think the Tetrarchy, it looks so perfect, but then he, and part of the reason it is perfect is that sons would not succeed their fathers as emperors, so it's more meritocratic.
yeah,
But then,
yeah, yeah,
of course, the sons want to succeed their
yeah,
fathers, right? They don't want to
yes,
be locked out of this
yes,
position. And
yes.
that's kind of what ends up happening and bringing about its downfall.
I think you're so right there. I think that it fails because it doesn't establish a hereditary monarchy, if you like, which is really what is necessary. And of course, that's exactly what Constantine sort of tries to achieve, although in a fairly fudged way with his own sons. And this is the big problem with Roman government, that the empire is so large and that there are such large armies in very far-flung locations, that you're going to get this separatism developing.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think that, as you say, Diocletian solves the problem on paper, but it isn't a practical solution. And I think Constantine recognizes this to some extent by moving the empire east. You have this shift towards the east, which I think is tremendously significant in, well, for the rest of the history of the Roman Empire, and arguably is the reason why the western half collapses, that the east becomes the center. And in a sense, that's a paradox, that the empire has become too big, and to govern it as one entity has become almost impossible. And the Tetrarchy fails, and Constantine, in a sense, also fails to do this by dividing the empire between his sons. And I mean, Julian the Apostate, I think, is fascinating because he reunites it, but essentially, up until this is now advancing well beyond our time period. But if we look at the problems that lead to the sack of Rome in 410, it's essentially the inability of the Roman government to maintain a coherent administration, political entity, and army. And, we end up with Theodosius the Great, or Theodosius the Not So Great, in my opinion, because he's the one who,
Uh-huh.
although he reunites the empire, he does it through civil war, and he brings in the Goths as the replacement for Roman legionaries, and that's all catastrophic. Sorry, I'm diverging onto a whole different thing. But I think the simple answer is, Gaius, that the Romans never solved the problem of being too big. That's the Tetrarchy is not the answer. Constantine's empire never solves it either.
Right. Yeah, and that actually brings me really closely into this other question I wanted to ask is that, you know, we do see a marked increase in stability during the latter portion of Diocletian into the Constantinian Empire. Obviously, there's a little civil war there, but who's counting? But after that, things achieve a level of stability that is more akin to the pre-crisis period than the crisis period. So, in your opinion, is that roughly century or so between the reign of Constantine and the sack of Rome and kind of kickstarting a series of events that leads to the eventual collapse of imperial rule in the western portion of the empire? Is that new order founded in part by Constantine, is that truly stable? Is that something that you view as potentially sustainable and could have kept going under its own inertia? Or was it always one of those things where, the bill is going to come due? There were serious structural error, oversights that would have led to collapse eventually, and it was inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge area, isn't it? And we're moving well into the fourth century and the lead up to the collapse of the Western Empire. And I think there's so much to look at here. I mean, I would suggest that it could have lasted the reformed empire under Diocletian and Constantine. And I think a great example of this is with Julian the Apostate, because to me, he is desperately unlucky
Mm-hmm.
that he is killed. He's killed. Probably it was a mistake to invade Persia in the 360s. That was probably biting off more than the empire could chew at that time. But the fact that he is killed creates a crisis. And then, big picture, we have a an unsatisfactory position internally within the empire after Julian the Apostate's death, combined with renewed pressure on the borders. And I think this is where the Huns come in. The Huns famously driving that domino effect with the Germans pushing the Goths yet again into the empire in an even more dramatic way. And the empire that's been to some extent broken by Julian the Apostate, unwittingly broken, but accidentally broken, has to face a new crisis of the third century, the crisis of the fourth century. And it's in
Mm-hmm.
that scenario that it buckles, that it finally buckles, it finally fails. So I'm sorry, we're covering a wider period of time here and moving on distinctly from the crisis of the third century. But to get back to your original point, which is to what extent is the empire restored after the crisis of the third century? My own feeling is that it is restored pretty well. We have a large Roman army, it's an indigenous one, it's not reliant on mercenaries until the Goths come in later in the fourth century. It's a reasonably prosperous empire, and I think it could have continued. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great answer, and I feel like I've read elsewhere the opinion that you know this decline in the West during the fourth century, or during the fifth century rather,
Mm,
is something that was not inevitable.
mm,
It
mm,
was a result
mm.
of a series of events, some unforeseeable,
Yeah,
some unfortunately
yeah.
preventable, but you know if we look at how and why it does end up collapsing in the fifth century in the western half of the empire, it actually kind of just undergirds just how resilient Rome was to endure an arguably worse run of events in the 3rd century.
Yes.
And that was right.
Yes. Yeah.
So
No,
you can jump off from that.
I'd love to pick up on your point there, because when you said a worse turn of events in the 3rd century, I mean that's kind of, I think, true, that the crisis of the 3rd century is unparalleled. I mean, and it's remarkable that Rome did survive. And what brings down the western half of the empire arguably is less severe, I think. And the reason why the Western Empire buckles eventually is due to a whole host of reasons, some of them accidental, some of them just straight, bad luck. Indeed, the Battle of Adrianople was bad luck, in my opinion. That could have been very different. And Julian's invasion of Persia could have been very different. Things could have gone in such a different way. I suppose the more complex and elusive analysis is what's going on within society, within the Roman Empire, to the ordinary people, to the elites. I think we have an interesting dynamic that I don't think historians have explored enough, which is the growth of the super rich, if you like, especially in the West, and the development of these latifundia, the sort of vast slave-run agricultural estates that replace the peasantry that, of course, in the Republican age, I mean, that's looking back hundreds of years, but was so important. And the senatorial class, I think, in the Western Empire can best be described as deeply irresponsible. They avoid paying
Yeah.
taxation. They contribute to the decline of the Roman army. Ultimately, they're destroyed. They are so foolish because they're signing their own death warrants. But I think I've never seen a historian really address the history of the Senate. But if you look at, for example, and now we're going into the 5th century, if we look at the Emperor Majorian, who tried a sort of last-ditch attempt to save the Western Empire, he's so critical of the aristocracy, the senators, who are just blind to the nemesis, that they're facing, and just trying to feather their own nests. And he's also very critical of the church. We haven't discussed this, but I think Christianity, I think it's a great religion, but it's very doubtful that it helped the Roman Empire much. It siphoned off a lot of resources. It caused a lot of religious division. And I think that's something that grows as an issue in the 4th and 5th centuries, and doesn't help the survival of the Western Roman Empire, I would suggest. So there's an enormous amount there to unpack, but those are some thoughts on some of the issues that you've raised.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and I'm totally in agreement with you on a lot of that diagnosis, in that I think it's a sign of really any empire or any state in crisis when people, especially at the elite level, stop viewing themselves as part of that shared project, and instead, as you mentioned,
Yeah,
concentrate on building their own
yeah,
wealth. And then, oh, I'll dodge the taxes, and, you know, that'll help me personally. And it will, but it's also like when you're in a society that is operating on the margins, as Rome always was, it's realizing that, well, everyone else is going to think the same way, right? Everyone else is going to try to dodge the taxes.
yes,
Everyone else is
yes,
going to shirk
yes,
their
yes,
civic and religious responsibilities. And I
yes,
think that, as you look at how
yes,
cities decline in this period, in part because we tend to focus on the wealth as being concentrated in Rome or Constantinople in the later era, when in reality, each city had their own
yeah,
local elite who were dynamic and incredibly important in the
yeah,
administration of that area. And I think you can kind of trace how the latifundia grow and how the estates of the wealthy, end up paving the way for later medieval serfdom, in the sense of like abandoning the cities in favor of their country villas, making labor less free by contracting them out to certain plots. And that's because the civic heart had been just eroded to such an extent that everyone started looking out for themselves as opposed to the grander national project. And, whether or not I always am asked about, well, what lessons does Rome have for us today? And I think that there's never a one-to-one. And I think that there's never, anytime someone tells you there is, or time someone draws a too tight a parallel by saying, oh, this politician is Augustus, this politician is Caligula. I think that's a little goofy. But I think that one of the things we can learn through the study of history is that various trends do recur, because at base, you and I are not terribly different from these people. We have similar impulses, similar desires, even similar fears. And so that pulling back, so when you see those mass trends like that of declining elite social responsibility during an age of crisis, precipitating something worse later, I think that's something where you can say, listen, I'm not gonna say that's exactly equivalent to a situation that happened today or a situation that happened even 100 years ago, but it's just a lesson we can learn. And it's not predictive, but it's helpful and it's illustrative, is how I approach, these modern comparisons, because Rome, the fall of Rome, it's always top of mind. But I feel like anyone who tries to do the really dramatic thing of saying this is exactly how it's going is selling a story as opposed to being historically accurate.
Well, I think you've made so many fascinating points there and this is straying off the topic of the third century, but I think, uh, firstly, your view of history, I think, is absolutely right, that there are always enormously interesting lessons to be drawn from history about what's going on at the present. And it's a tricky one because you don't want to oversimplify, you don't want to make, inane comparisons. But there are a lot of very meaningful comparisons to be made, I think. And just jumping on your very interesting observation about urban development or the decline of urban development in the Western Roman Empire. I mean, I think if we're looking at a longer time period, sorry, this is getting ridiculously far from the third century, but we're seeing the beginning, as you say, of the medieval state, of feudalism, of deurbanization. Well, I mean, there is deurbanization in the Roman period, I would say, and that's what creates the anarchic feudal societies that we have in the Middle Ages, which ultimately, of course, the Italian Renaissance and the growth of cities in the late Middle Ages corrects. But I think you're on to an absolutely key theme there that begins in the Roman period. And it's a fascinating element of continuity between the ancient world and the modern. And it doesn't happen in the East to nearly the same extent. I
Mm-hmm.
think in the East, we have clearly an urban environment that is preserved, and it's preserved even with the Arab conquests. I think this is the amazing thing that the early caliphates maintain. There's only one Roman city that they really destroy, and it's Carthage. And they preserve all the others and they continue Roman civilization. But sorry, this is now going well beyond our period. So,
No, that's all good, because actually, as we kind of do wrap up, I did want to give you a chance to talk about the wider breadth of your knowledge. And like, obviously, I think we're taking the third century as our starting point, but your work goes well beyond that. So as I found this conversation incredibly stimulating, and I'd love to do it again to maybe hone in on certain other areas and certain other aspects of Roman history leading up to this, decline in the West, the emergence of the medieval period. So, are there any projects that you're working on, in that vein? Anything that you'd like to share with the audience, or any social media where they could perhaps find you and learn your thoughts on this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really do social media too much, but what I do is my website, and I would just be thrilled if you wanted to get a free ebook, because I have a free ebook on my website, which is actually the first history book I wrote, and it's about the origins of the First Crusade, and it's about the Battle of Manzikert and the fall of Byzantium in the 11th century, which is a direct continuation of the Roman Empire, Roman history. And so you can go to my website, which is nickholmesauthor.com, and you can get that book for free. And I'd be delighted if you wanted to do that. And finally, on the work that I'm doing at the moment, well, I'm concluding my history of the fall of the Roman Empire, and I'm concluding it actually with the Dark Ages, because for me, the Dark Ages were in the shadow of the Roman Empire, and I suggest that all three of the great empires of that age. So the Arab Empire, I think the Umayyad Caliphate is so successful because it adopts so much of Roman administration. I mean, it almost takes what Diocletian did and uses it for its own purpose. And then you have the Byzantines, obviously, and then you have Charlemagne's empire, which I think is so important as a link to the Roman era, because Charlemagne reinvents really the idea of the Roman Empire, and it stayed with Europe ever since. And so that's my latest book, which is not yet published but should be out in June.
All right. Well, thanks. It's all super interesting, and I think that that's a great way to kind of connect these two eras that we arbitrarily view as like entirely distinct, and the progression of history is going to influence how things emerge later. But as historians, there's these arbitrary cutoff dates that we kind of just assign to certain eras, and then say, okay, well, here is this, and now everything's different. And
Yes, yes.
there's just been so much great work recently illustrating that the quote unquote fall of Rome in the West was really not that dramatic, instant, like nuclear bomb going off type civilizational collapse, as opposed to like a slow deterioration and then the emergence of something new that's more adapted to conditions as they exist on the ground, that and then the erosion of Roman civic and religious and cultural identity is kind of slow, and it ebbs and flows according to certain eras. It's not an apocalyptic event that where everyone is just instantly reduced to living in mud huts, right? So anyway, I look forward to reading that, because again, I am a Roman history guy, but at a certain point you realize like everything's interesting and everything's dynamic and everything's connected. So I really appreciate your time, and I would love to have you back on at a later date to talk about, Attila, who we didn't get into as much as I wanted to. Your book on him is excellent. So, you just named the topic, and I'd love to do this again.
Well, thanks, Gaius, for the opportunity to chat with you. It's been really, really exciting, and I just look forward to the next one.
Likewise, and I hope the audience does as well, because there will be a next one, folks. So anyways, stay tuned. Thanks again. Take care.
Talk soon.
Bye.